Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most pivotal and dramatic struggles in human history, a clash between the might of the world's greatest empire and the unwavering faith of a growing religious movement that would eventually reshape the world. To understand the history of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire is to look into the heart of ancient power, political identity, and the slow, painful transformation of the Western world. For the story of the early church is inextricably linked to the fires of Rome, the sands of the Colosseum, and the edicts of emperors who saw the followers of Christ not just as a religious minority, but as a direct threat to the very fabric of civilization. The Roman Empire, at its height, was a behemoth of diversity and structure, a polytheistic society that thrived on the integration of various cultures and their deities, generally extending a hand of tolerance to the religions of conquered peoples, provided they accepted the political supremacy of Rome. Within this environment of relative religious plurality, early Christianity began to grow, starting as a small sect within Judaism, but rapidly evolving into a distinct movement that swept through the empire's cities and trade routes, carrying a message that challenged the status quo. Yet, this growth was met with suspicion and eventually state-sanctioned violence, initiating centuries of persecution that would test the limits of human endurance and faith. This video will explore the history, reasons, and impact of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire from its early days under Nero to the eventual rise of Christianity as the official religion of the empire, tracing the complex relationship between a state demanding absolute loyalty and a faith demanding absolute devotion. To truly grasp why this conflict occurred, we must first examine the nature of the Roman Empire and its unique approach to religious tolerance. The Roman state was fundamentally polytheistic, believing that the safety and prosperity of the empire depended on the pax deorum, or the peace of the gods, a transactional arrangement where correct ritual practice ensured divine favor. Because of this, Romans were generally accepting of various deities and religions, often syncretizing foreign gods with their own, creating a vast inclusive pantheon that spanned from the temples of Jupiter in Rome to the mystery cults of Isis and Mithras in the provinces. This religious diversity, however, was underpinned by a political non-negotiable, the role of emperor worship and state religion. As the empire expanded, the imperial cult became a unifying force, a test of political loyalty where subjects were expected to offer sacrifices for the emperor's well-being, a ritual that signified their allegiance to Rome itself. Before the rise of Christianity, this system accommodated almost everyone, including practitioners of Judaism and other Eastern mystery religions, albeit with occasional friction. Judaism, for instance, held a unique and often precarious position due to its monotheism, but the Romans largely granted Jews an exemption from emperor worship because of the antiquity of their traditions, respecting their stubborn adherence to their ancestral laws. However, the early Christians refused to worship Roman gods, finding themselves in a far more vulnerable position than their Jewish predecessors. As Christianity separated from Judaism, it lost the protective umbrella of the Jewish exemption, and its adherents began to face the issue of rejecting Roman religious practices, especially emperor worship. This refusal was not merely a matter of private belief, it was seen as a public act of treason, a withdrawal of support from the state and the gods who protected it. By refusing to participate in the public sacrifices that were thought to secure the pax deorum, Christians were accused of endangering the empire, inviting the wrath of the gods, and essentially acting as atheists, in the sense that they denied the existence of the state pantheon. This clash of ideologies set the stage for the first major conflict, marking the beginning of official persecution under the Emperor Nero. The year was 64 AD, and Rome had been ravaged by a devastating fire that consumed large swaths of the city, leaving thousands homeless and the populace in a state of shock and anger. Rumors swirled that Nero himself had started the fire to clear land for his ambitious building projects, specifically his grand palace, the Domus Aurea. Desperate to deflect the growing suspicion and wrath of the Roman citizens, Nero found a convenient scapegoat in the Christians, a group already viewed with suspicion and distaste by the general populace. This marked Nero and the first major persecution, a turning point where the state first utilized its power to annihilate the Christian community. Nero's use of Christians as scapegoats after the fire of Rome was brutal and theatrical, characteristic of his erratic reign. He had Christians arrested, tortured, and executed in the most gruesome ways imaginable to satisfy the public's desire for vengeance. Public executions in the Colosseum and other arenas became spectacles of horror, where Christians were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or nailed to crosses, or burned alive as living torches to illuminate Nero's gardens during his nightly parties. It was during this time that tradition holds the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, the two great pillars of the early church, occurred in Rome, cementing the city's role as a center of Christian memory. While Nero's persecution was initially localized to Rome and driven by personal political expediency rather than a systematic legal policy, it established a terrifying precedent. Christians were officially recognized as criminals worthy of death. Following Nero, the empire saw widespread social and political tensions regarding this growing sect. Christians were a minority, but their numbers were increasing and their perceived threat to Roman order became more pronounced. Their refusal to worship the emperor and attend Roman religious ceremonies marked them as outsiders, and their secretive meetings and distinct moral code led to wild accusations of incest, cannibalism, and other perversions. Christians were accused of being atheists and disloyal to the state, a charge that carried a death sentence in a society that valued civic duty and religious conformity above all else. This social stigma laid the groundwork for future emperors to target the community, moving from Nero's specific scapegoating to a broader, more systemic oppression. The next major phase of persecution arose under Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD. Emperor Domitian's anti-Christian policies were driven by his demand to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, or Lord and God, a title that Christians could not, in good conscience, ascribe to a mortal man. Domitian's reign was marked by paranoia and a ruthless demand for conformity, leading to the execution of prominent Christians, such as John the Apostle, who, according to tradition, was boiled in oil and exiled to the island of Patmos. Domitian's reign demonstrated that the persecution was not a one-off event but a recurring danger for the Church, rooted in the fundamental incompatibility of Christian monotheism and Roman imperial theology. As the empire moved into the 2nd century, the persecution expanded, becoming more systemic and legally defined. A crucial moment came with Trajan's rescript in 112 AD, a document that provided the first official legal framework for dealing with Christians. Emperor Trajan's policy on Christians was pragmatic yet deadly. The state would neither actively seek them out nor condone their execution unless they were found guilty of refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. This policy was articulated in his correspondence with Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia Pontus, who was unsure how to handle the influx of accused Christians. Trajan instructed that Christians were not to be hunted, but if denounced and tried, they must offer sacrifice to the gods and the emperor or face execution. This placed Christians in a perilous position. They could live in peace only as long as they remained anonymous. But the moment they were accused, their faith required them to choose between Christ and their life. Consequently, Christians who were arrested, tried, and executed for their faith became a common sight in the provinces, their deaths serving as both a warning and a testimony. The 2nd century also saw the persecution under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who reigned from 161 to 180 AD. Despite his reputation for wisdom and stoic virtue, Marcus Aurelius viewed Christianity with disdain, seeing it as a fanatical and irrational superstition that undermined Roman discipline. The role of philosophers and local officials in condemning Christians was significant during his reign, as they often reinforced the narrative that Christian stubbornness was the cause of public calamities. In various provinces, natural disasters and military threats were blamed on the presence of Christians, leading to local outbreaks of violence and state-sanctioned executions. The most famous case from this period is the martyrdom of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp, an elderly man who had known the Apostle John, was arrested and brought to the arena. When asked to curse Christ, he famously replied, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? His steadfastness in the face of death and the miraculous accounts of his execution where the fire failed to burn him inspired the early Christian community and solidified the theology of martyrdom. The martyrdom of Polycarp and other notable early Christian martyrs during this era showed that the Roman state was willing to enforce its religious requirements rigorously, and that the Christians were willing to die rather than comply. However, the worst was yet to come, as the empire entered a period of existential crisis in the 3rd century. The persecutions under Decius and Valerian marked a shift from local or reactionary suppression to a deliberate empire-wide attempt to eradicate Christianity. Emperor Decius issued an edict in 250 AD, requiring all citizens to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate, libellus, proving they had done so. This was the first universally enforced decree against Christianity, aiming not just to punish, but to force apostasy. The machinery of the state was turned against the church with terrifying efficiency. Increased state-directed persecution included the arrest and execution of Christian leaders and the destruction of Christian texts. Decius believed that the empire's troubles were due to the neglect of the old gods, and he was determined to rectify this through forced conformity. Although Decius died in battle, the precedent was set. His successor, Valerian, continued the pressure, specifically targeting the leadership of the church, issuing edicts in 257 and 258 AD that forbade Christian assemblies and ordered the execution of bishops and senators who were Christians. The martyrdom of Pope Fabian and others under Valerian highlighted the vulnerability of the church's hierarchy, but also the resilience of its members who went into hiding or faced death bravely. This era of Decius and Valerian's persecutions demonstrated that the Roman state now viewed the church as an enemy to be dismantled. This leads us to the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of increasing persecution amid empire instability. The Roman Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse, besieged by civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic depression, and plagues. Political and military turmoil contributed to a heightened sense of threat from Christians, who were seen as a fifth column, a group that refused to integrate and therefore weakened the empire's ability to defend itself. Religious scapegoating during times of crisis, such as the Cyprian plague and military defeats, became a standard response. Emperors and local magistrates looked for someone to blame, and the Christians, with their refusal to sacrifice, were the easiest targets. It was believed that the gods were angry because the Christians were ignoring them, and until the Christians were dealt with, the empire would suffer. In this climate of fear and desperation, Christian martyrdom became a powerful response. The growth of Christian martyrdom stories during this period served to galvanize the community. Accounts of bravery, such as that of Perpetua and Felicity in Carthage, who faced wild beasts in the arena with their heads held high, circulated widely, encouraging others to remain steadfast. The rise of local Christian leaders who encouraged unwavering faith in the face of death provided a counter-narrative to the Roman power. Where Rome offered death, the Church offered eternal life. The significant role of Christian women and children in the martyrdom narratives also challenged Roman social norms, showing that the faith cut across all demographics and that the bond of Christian community was stronger than the family unit or the fear of death. Yet, as the crisis deepened, the political landscape was about to shift dramatically. The turning point arrived with Constantine and the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. The conversion of Constantine is one of the most debated and consequential moments in history. Before a pivotal battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Constantine, seeking divine assistance, looked to the sky and saw a vision of the cross, or the Chi symbol, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine's conversion and the political implications for Christianity in the empire were immediate and profound. Whether his conversion was a genuine spiritual awakening or a calculated political move, the result was the end of the age of persecution. The vision of the cross and its impact on the emperor's policies led directly to the Edict of Milan. This decree, issued jointly by Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, established the legalization of Christianity in 313 AD. It proclaimed religious tolerance for all religions, ending the official state persecution of Christians and restoring their property and rights. This was a monumental shift. The Church went from being an outlawed and hunted sect to a legally recognized and protected entity. The end of official state persecution of Christians allowed the faith to flourish openly, marking the beginning of state-sponsored support for Christian communities. Constantine began to fund the building of churches, involve bishops in his court, and integrate Christian symbolism into the imperial iconography. The transformation was complete. The empire that had once burned Christians as torches now looked to their God for protection. This historical trajectory raises critical questions about the theological and social impact of persecution. The development of Christian theology under persecution was instrumental in shaping the identity of the early church. The role of suffering in Christian identity was deeply rooted in the teachings of Christ, who had himself suffered and died on a Roman cross. The early Christians saw their suffering as a participation in the sufferings of Christ, a way to bear witness to the truth of the gospel. This led to the emergence of martyrdom as a powerful theological symbol, a baptism of blood that was considered even more glorious than a peaceful death. The impact of persecution on early Christian liturgy and worship was also significant. The veneration of martyrs, relics, the celebration of their feast days, and the focus on the Eucharist as a sacrifice all grew out of this context of suffering. The growth of Christianity, despite persecution, is a testament to the paradoxical power of the movement. Rather than stamping out the faith, the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the Church, as the early Christian writer Tertullian famously noted. The courage of the martyrs served as a powerful witness, or martyria, that attracted converts who were drawn to a faith that could inspire such devotion. The appeal of Christian teachings in the face of suffering offered a hope that transcended the grim realities of Roman life, promising a kingdom not of this world where every tear would be wiped away. This resilience forced the shift from underground meetings in catacombs and private homes to public worship in grand basilicas, a transition that would alter the urban landscape of the empire. Finally, we must consider the legacy of Roman persecution on Christianity. Christianity's influence on Western civilization post-Roman Empire is immeasurable, and much of that influence was shaped by the centuries of suffering endured by the early believers. The influence of Roman martyrdom stories on later Christian ethics and culture created a deep-seated respect for the willingness to die for one's beliefs, influencing concepts of liberty, of conscience, and resistance to tyranny. The role of persecution in shaping Christian views on authority, the state, and religious freedom created a complex legacy. While the Church eventually became an institution of power, its foundational experience was one of marginalization, a memory that would occasionally resurface to challenge ecclesiastical corruption and state overreach. Roman martyrs in Christian tradition remained potent figures of inspiration. The continued veneration of Roman martyrs in Christian liturgical calendars, where days are set aside to honor saints like Lawrence, Sebastian, Agnes, and Cecilia, keeps the memory of the persecution alive. These saints are not just historical figures, but intercessors and models of holiness. The enduring impact of early Christian persecution on the Church's view of suffering and redemption is still felt today, teaching that the path to victory often leads through the valley of the shadow of death. In conclusion, the history of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire is a sweeping saga of conflict and transformation. We have surveyed the origins of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire, tracing it from Nero's scapegoating to the systemic purges of Decius and Diocletian. We have identified the key emperors involved, from the mad tyranny of Nero and Domitian to the philosophical disdain of Marcus Aurelius and the pragmatic conversion of Constantine. We have analyzed the reasons for persecution, rooted in the clash between Roman civic duty and Christian exclusive monotheism, and the theological and social consequences for Christians, who turned the arena into a pulpit and their deaths into a testimony. The eventual triumph of Christianity and the transformation of the Roman Empire under Constantine marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, but the scars of the persecution remained, shaping the soul of the Church. The story forces us to reflect on the resilience of early Christians, men and women who faced lions, swords, and flames rather than deny their Lord. Their lasting impact on Christian thought and practice is a reminder that faith is not merely a set of beliefs, but a commitment that can withstand the greatest pressures the world can impose. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, exploring the trials, tribulations, and ultimate triumph of the early Christian Church.